So he's talking, we can't get it. Looks like to me.
It doesn't look like he's talking to me.
Oh.
Because this is him.
He's drinking.
Yeah.
Yeah, testing.
Try it.
Folks, you able to hear me now?
Okay.
Yeah, I think this might be our best option.
Okay, let's do that. I don't know these are even. Okay.
All right, better than nothing. Okay, hello everyone on Zoom. Welcome. Sorry for the delay. Thanks for bearing with, I guess, everybody as we try to figure out the technical difficulties. Those who were here last week, either in person or over Zoom, got to experience some of the visual troubleshooting that we needed to do. This week we had audio troubleshooting, and yet we are going to succeed in getting to learn together. So I guess, yeah, let's get started. Okay. Thanks all of you for joining today. It's great to see a lot of folks again with a hush of new guest who has joined us for part two. So with the permission, Rabbi,
You have to come today.
no. So yeah, what Birshut, the Rav. Let's give a quick summary, 2 minutes or less, hopefully, of some of the issues that we raised last week. 2 minutes might be aspirational. We'll do our best. So that we can, prime our engine for today and sort of pick up where we left off. And also for those of you who weren't here, either in person or virtually, so that you'll have a little bit of a sense of what we talked about. Today is going to be very historically focused, but last week was much more conceptually focused. I tried to sort of break down this question, what is anti-Semitism? Not into sort of what has anti-Semitism looked like, assuming there is a thing called anti-Semitism that has developed across time. But instead, we sort of took the question of what would it mean to use a lens or a term like anti-Semitism, and what embedded kinds of arguments does the very terminology itself imply? So we use this kind of a thought experiment. This image, this is what I call the Rorschach test. We sort of work together to decode, from what I remember, at least 4 possible meanings this could have, right? This could be a Jewish blotting out of Nazism with a Star of David superimposed, sort of quashing a swastika. It could, of course, be exactly the opposite, right? A kind of a neo-Nazi, right? Anti-Star of David, pro-swastika, as we saw in a couple of these other examples. It could be an equation of a Star of David with a swastika, right? And depending on which of those possibilities, so the first one would be this is an assertion of Jewish power, right? The second one would be this is an assertion of a white supremacist, racist, Nazi ideology, anti-Semitic by any stretch of the imagination, I think. This third possibility would be to say, no, this is a more radical, let's call it left-wing, although it's not a helpful term particularly, but a political critique of the state of Israel. And then that would get us into very tricky conversations about the Star of David as a Zionist symbol versus a Jewish symbol. Can those be distinguished from one another? Very tricky topic. But then we also noted, there's another example of this. We also noted that it might not have anything to do with Jews or Israel or Nazis at all, right? That swastika superimposed over 6-pointed stars, depending on where and when you're seeing it, may reflect visual culture of, let's say, Southeast Asia or other parts of the world that has nothing whatsoever to do with Jews. Symbols like these predate the association of the Star of David with Jews and predate the association of the swastika with Nazis. And what we sort of took away from that thought experiment and working together was that this symbol that we saw could mean one thing, it could mean something else. It may be about Jews, it may not. The tenor of the critique of Jews may differ, but that the continuities in form across those 4 different interpretations actually can distract us from the very, very dramatic differences in content, right? The form is the same no matter which of the 4 interpretations you adopt. It's the same shape, it's the same visual, but the meaning that will come out of that form is going to be dramatically different depending on where and when you see it. And this was sort of the argument in favor of a contextual approach to studying what we think of as anti-Semitism. We sort of contrasted 2 different ways that historians have tended to tell the story of anti-Semitism. The first was this idea of a trans-historical anti-Semitism as something that is viral, that exists as an entity, that's passed down from person to person, from place to place, from time to time, but that has a kind of an unbroken, continuous existence. So that if you want to understand the nature of anti-Semitism, you know, in the 21st century or in the 1st century or in the 5th century BCE, you're basically looking at the same underlying phenomenon. Whereas, and this was, we sort of encoded this with the term the longest hatred. This is Robert Wistrich, the historian, who is best known for adopting this approach. Anti-Semitism is a coherent thing. It always has been. It always will be. And we saw in a slide that I don't have today, but that we looked at last time, that one of the sort of implications of this transhistorical approach, the longest hatred that is always around, is that many people have argued that because anti-Semitism is continuous, because it has always been the same on some underlying conceptual level, it's therefore not even, there's not really that much of a point of studying it, or certainly not much of a point of attempting to combat it. Because if you remember one of the slides that we read, it was from the National Review, right, this sort of like a conservative publication. And the quote was something along the lines of, anybody who thinks that they will be able to defeat anti-Semitism right, would be trying to beat COVID. Folks at home, can you hear me again? Yeah, folks at home, can you hear me? Yeah. You're nodding. Okay. I'm sorry, we got disconnected again. So I'm going to try and share my screen one more time. But those of you who were here last time might remember we went through a few rounds of this. Some strange reason eventually it settled down. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Working again, I hope. Okay, it kicked me off of Zoom. I had to re-sign on again. I hope it's not going to happen, you know, again and again. So our contextual approach was to say that if you want to understand specific discrete instances of anti-Jewish violence, anti-Jewish rhetoric, anti-Jewish sentiment, that the explanatory sort of like approach shouldn't be to link up that episode in a long-term pattern, a chain of every other episode, and to say that each episode sheds light on the others, right? Because at the end of the day, they're all the same. But instead, would say if you want to understand something that gets called anti-Semitism in the 19th century, look in its 19th century context. If you want to understand something in the 12th century, look in its 12th century context. Reading the 19th century in light of the 12th century, or the 12th century in light of the 19th century, these historians would say that's actually going to distract you. That's going to mislead you. It's going to maybe force you to see continuities in form, but those are going to trick you into missing the vast differences in content, right? So again, as with our symbol of the Star of David and the swastika, do we assume that all of the possible manifestations of that one underlying symbol are in some way the same? Or are we open to the possibility that what looks the same actually is more different than it is similar? So that was our sort of conceptual introduction to the topic, and we parsed it through one particular example at the end last time, which was supposedly the most ancient example of anti-Semitism, the Book of Esther, right? And we saw that line that gets put into the mouth of Haman. There's this one nation that's different from everybody else, and we shouldn't tolerate them. We need to wipe them out. And we said that on the sort of surface, on the level of form, that looks exactly like Nazi rhetoric. It looks exactly like medieval Christian anti-Jewish rhetoric. It looks like something that you would hear at a demonstration in 2024. And yet when we started to dig into the sources, into the texts themselves, so we came to realize that the source in which we find that utterance was written by Jews, for Jews, maybe not as a historical document, maybe as something else. We talked about, is this parody? Is this satire? Is it history, or does it even pretend to be history? Would the readers or the listeners of that text in its original context have understood that this is not a text to be taken seriously? It's like a Purim spiel before Purim, right? I'm not saying that's the only way to understand the text, but if we went in that direction, if we said, maybe this is a story that historically we can't take at face value, so then maybe the anti-Semitic sentiment also can't be taken at face value if there never was a Haman and if he never said this line, right? So that was just one example of, for some of the ancient material, the care with which we need to read the sources in order not to just fall into a trap of saying, well, this is Nazism, but in ancient Persia, right? And instead to say, maybe this is something else. And our filter, where we look to create patterns, is actually going to mislead us. Today, I want to do the same thing. And I should mention that we just also, for those of you who weren't here, this is an important point. We also talked about the origins of the term anti-Semitism itself, right? Which, as we pointed out, is invented in the 19th century for very specific racial reasons, right? The racial science of the late 19th century in Germany is very different from what most people would take at face value today. As we'll see, it's very different from the beliefs about Jews that were circulating in earlier time periods also. So again, a contextualist might say, the fact that the term anti-Semitism is invented at a specific time and place means that the phenomenon of anti-Semitism is also limited to that time and place. And when we see similar looking things in other periods of time, we should call them different things because on some level they may be sort of, deep down, very more different than they are similar. So that was just to give a sense of the actual terminology, where it comes from. We talked about Noah's 3 sons and Semitic languages and all that stuff. Okay, let's jump ahead in time a little bit. Today we're going to focus on a couple of ancient and a couple of medieval examples. And if we had more time, we would do early modern and contemporary examples too. We only have 2 sessions together, so we have to sort of pick and choose. I decided to focus our attention on some of the older material today, instead of talking about, I don't know, the Holocaust and anti-Zionism in the state of Israel, just because those are topics that people probably encounter more often in conversation, in the news, in synagogue maybe, whereas some of this older material I don't think is as readily accessible usually. That's at least my sense. So I thought I could add value more by delving into this than by doing another rehash of, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism or not? I'm happy to always talk about that topic, but maybe not for today. Okay. When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. Do we know this scene? Do we know this line? So this is one of the most iconic scenes in the Gospel of Matthew, which describes the moment that Jesus's death, his death sentence rather, is sealed. Because in the story, as I'm sure many of us know, the Roman Empire, which rules over Roman Palestine, Judea, in the 1st century, is represented by this guy, the procurator Pontius Pilate, who in the telling of the Gospels finds himself presented with this kind of lose-lose situation. The factions within the Jewish population come to him and ask him to kill, to crucify, to execute Jesus, this rabble-rousing preacher who's wandering the countryside, kind of stirring up trouble among the Jewish elites. Pilate, for moral reasons, depending on how you read this exactly, certainly this is the way it'll get understood later, has a lot of qualms about executing what he thinks might be an innocent man, maybe even a holy man, Jesus. But his hand is forced because he knows there's going to be a rebellion among the Jews if he doesn't follow their will. And so he gets up at the moment of the death sentence being passed and says, I don't want this. I don't want to kill Jesus. I don't have any choice. But I personally am innocent of this man's blood. It's your responsibility. And the crowd he's speaking to here very explicitly is the Jews. The Jews in the Gospels sometimes get described as the Pharisees, sometimes get described as the Sadducees. There's different sects among the Jews in 1st century Judea. More on this in just a second. But the general sort of opposition here is between the Roman authority and whoever they are, the mob, the rabble of Jews who are sort of agitating for the death of Jesus. And the response they give, the response that they're quoted as giving in the text, will go on to, it's hard to overstate how significant a line this will be. His blood is upon us and upon our children. We get it. we absolve you of any responsibility. We are determined that this guy is going to die, and we take on his blood guilt, not only on ourselves, but sort of eternally onto all of our descendants and all of our offspring. Yeah, go ahead.
Who invoked the death sentence?
Who invoked the death sentence?
He's washing his, yeah.
Yeah, he's washing his hands of it, sort of declaiming any kind of personal responsibility, but he is the ruler who is ultimately sentencing this guy to death. Yeah.
It's a historical point that resonated with me, that the Jewish rabble, the Jewish rabbis, the Sanhedrin, under Roman law, under Roman occupation, did not have the power to invoke a death sentence.
So yeah, so I think what you're pointing to here is really important, right? Which is that, as you know, and as we're going to talk about in a little bit, this idea of the Jewish responsibility for having killed Jesus, who is eventually going to be understood as the Jewish Messiah, right, by Christians, or as the Son of God. The charge eventually gets to be called deicide, killing God, right? Homicide is killing a person, fratricide is killing your parent, deicide is killing God. And that's what the Jews are understood to have done according to this line. And a lot of the pushback from people who defend Jews against this charge is to say, no, the Jews didn't really have any ultimate power in this situation. The Romans are the ones who ruled. The Romans are the ones who carried out the death sentence. To give the Jews any kind of credit for this, just because they were in favor, according to this text, would be, assigning them much too much responsibility and also absolving the Romans of the responsibility that they had. It's a very, very, I think, plausible argument. In a way, though, it skips some of the interesting analytical work that we could do about this text. Because one question we would ask is, as with the Book of Esther, just because a text from 2,000 years ago tells this story, does that mean that it happened? So it's not clear, right? Historians have a lot of different views about the historical Jesus and about whether any kind of story like this really ever took place, right? There probably was a guy named Jesus. He probably was crucified. That seems pretty consensus driven among historians. But the circumstances by which he died, whether these are reliable historical documents at all, that is very, very open to question. And need to go in that direction and say, no, it was really Pilate's fault. Because the text itself might not have any kind of credence whatsoever. Complicating matters further, this we don't have time to get into today, I don't think, but I'll just lay it out there. It's a little bit of like a bomb that I'm just going to drop and then run from. But in later Jewish sources, many Jewish authors are more than happy to take credit for killing Jesus. If you read the Talmud has an explicit scene where the Jews say, yup, we got him, right? It was our responsibility. It was our accomplishment. And the people who actually put Jesus to death was the Jewish Sanhedrin. Now, that's probably not historically true. But it shows that the Jews weren't always afraid of this charge. Sometimes, at least when they were speaking to themselves, and they really, suffered under Christian rule terribly for a long time and had a lot of antipathy towards Christians at many points in time. And one of the ways they sometimes expressed that was to be like, yep, we killed him. Right? Good job, us. And it's not comfortable to talk about, I think, in interfaith settings, certainly, but the documents are there. We can't sort of ignore them. We're already getting a sense that a text like this one is very complicated, can be taken in a lot of different interpretive directions. But there's one more point about it that we haven't raised yet that I want to make sure to point to, which is that, as I'm sure we all know, Jesus was a Jew. Jesus' disciples were all Jews. The people who told the earliest biographical stories about Jesus that would eventually come to make up the Gospels were Jews. The intended audience for those stories was Jews. And for the first, let's say at least the first few decades, but probably longer, the center of gravity among Christianity were Jews who saw Christianity as a natural expression, a natural fulfillment of their own Jewishness, right? It wasn't Jewish or Christian, it was Jewish Christian. And so that takes us in a different kind of complicated direction, right? Because when we read a text like this one, which is the most anti-Semitic source in history, this line is quoted from Robert Wistrich, our friend who wrote the book, The Longest Hatred, right? So that doesn't really fully account for the fact that the authors and audience and subject of the most anti-Semitic source in history were all Jewish people. So what do we sort of do with that, again, from an analytical direction, when we think about the anti-Semitic resonances or the anti-Jewish resonances of a text that clearly was written by Jews, for Jews, about Jews, right? Addressed to fellow Jews. We'll complicate matters a little bit further. Oh, somebody has a hand up. Let's go to Randy, and then we'll continue a little bit.
Going back to the one of
Here's where our speaker system is going to be a problem. Randy, we can't hear you, I don't think.
forget it.
I'm really sorry. Yeah, if you don't mind, folks who have questions, until we can get the audio sorted out, if we get it sorted out, folks at home, if you can put your questions into the chat, I'll try and check it regularly and read the questions out. I'm sorry. Okay, we've got multiple people monitoring the chat, so your questions will get addressed, I promise. Complicating matters further. Other gospel texts are similarly suffused with anti-Jewish material. So this is a line, sort of a famous line from the Gospel of John, one of the other biographical stories about Jesus that gets codified into the New Testament. Talking about the Jews, this is quoting Jesus. So this is supposedly Jesus speaking in the Gospels, saying to the Jews, and here they're identified just as the Jews, you belong to your father, the devil, and you want to carry out your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning, not holding to the truth, for there's no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks his native language, for he's a liar and the father of lies. Whoever belongs to God hears what God says, but you do not hear, because you, Jews, don't belong to God. Who do you belong to? Again, the devil. There's this demonization of the Jews. There's this sharp split between us, who are the children of God, and you, who are the children of Satan. And then there's all those moral qualities that go along with being a child of Satan. You're a liar, you're a hypocrite, you're a murderer. Again, a text put in the mouth of Jesus, who was Jewish, addressing it to his Jewish followers, calling all of them demons, essentially, children of Satan, liars and murderers. So a big question that people who study this material need to sort of think through and to grapple with is, how did it come to be that a movement within the Jewish community eventually becomes the source of so many of these anti-Jewish ideas that are going to reverberate throughout history? The idea of deicide, the idea of Satanism, the idea that Jews are murderers and liars and hypocrites, and so on and so forth. And the guy who deserves most of the credit for this, ironically, also a Jew. And that's Saul of Tarsus, St. Paul. Anybody know St. Paul from the Gospels? I don't want to delve too deeply in things that people might know some stuff about already, but it's impossible to talk about ancient and medieval anti-Judaism without getting a sense of Paul's theology of Jews, because Paul develops an idea that comes to be called supersessionism. Paul is one of Jesus's earliest followers after Jesus's death. You might know the story about Paul on the road to Damascus, right? He was originally a Pharisee, a Jew who oppressed the Christian Jews that lived within Jewish communities, but he has this sort of revelation from God, a prophetic experience, and eventually he becomes the most devout expositor of Christianity, first to his fellow Jews, who by and large don't really accept it, and then eventually to non-Jews. Paul is the guy, a few decades already after Jesus's death, who begins to reconfigure Christianity as a religion that's for everybody, rather than just a religion for Jewish people, which again is how it originally seems to have been understood. Jesus is Christ. Christ means the Jewish Messiah. It's just Greek for the anointed one, because he was understood within a Jewish framework. Christ is the Logos, or the Son of God, according to the early Christians. Those are also Jewish categories. These are sort of, Jesus would only have been understandable to his earlier followers through the lens of their Jewishness, but Paul sort of explodes all of that and opens it out to non-Jews as well. And the theology he develops to account for that, again, is called supersessionism, and it basically goes as follows. God made a covenant with the Jewish people. That's the Old Testament, and it's the Old Testament because it has been abrogated, right? The promises that God made to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses, originally those were sort of channeled towards the physical descendants, the Jewish people of those figures, but they kept on screwing up. They sinned, they killed their prophets, they killed Jesus, they killed God, right, in that sense. And so God realized these guys are irredeemable. And the testament, the covenant that I made with them is now superseded. It's old, and I'm going to make a new covenant, a new testament with the new Jews. And those new Jews are not going to be the physical Jews. It's going to be the spiritual Jews, which is to say any Gentile who believes in Jesus becomes Jewish in a way, but they become more Jewish than the original physical Jews that God had originally tried to make a covenant with and who he has now replaced. So this idea, again, supersessionism, that the role of the Jews has been superseded by the new Jews on the block. And those new Jews he calls spiritual Israel, as opposed to the old Jews, which are carnal Israel, the physical Jews. Now, or sometimes he calls this Virus Israel too, right? The true Israel. The true Israel is not the physical ones, it's the spiritual ones. And Paul basically uses this as a way of explaining why the practice of Christianity is going to be all about faith and belief and not about physical observance, right? Physical observance was the way you could reach the physical Jews because that was the way they thought. They couldn't think beyond their bodies. They weren't spiritual enough. Whereas the new Israel, the Virus Israel, the Christians, you don't need to actually like circumcise your genitals, right? If you're, so you circumcise your heart. That's the spiritual meaning of circumcision. If you're using it to cut off your foreskin, like it just shows how blinkered your thinking is. Like you totally missed the point. Does God care whether you eat pork or shellfish or not? So the carnal Israel reading the Hebrew Bible would say, yeah, there's explicit stuff on the books about it. Paul says, it's all metaphorical. It's about what goes into your body and then what comes out of your body. The speech and the words that you consume and that you, right? There's this whole sort of metaphoricization, is that a word? You know what I mean? Of the Hebrew Bible in the New Testament in ways that accept the status of Jews. To be a Jew is a good thing, but it just means the right kind of Jew, the spiritual Israel, not the old-fashioned, sort of physical Jews by lineage or by ethnicity or by birth or whatever.
I always heard Paul dealt with three big issues about male circumcision, the dietary laws, and keeping the Sabbath. Is that true?
Totally. Yeah. There's all kinds of really evocative language. A lot of this comes through in Paul's writings. If you pick up a copy of the New Testament, right, the majority of it is the writings or the supposed writings of Paul, the epistles that he writes to different Christian communities, the Galatians and the Romans and the Hebrews. But there's also one of the books in Christian scripture called the Book of Acts, which sort of narrates the life story of Paul. And he has all these fabulous visions, him and other early Christians, that focus attention specifically on food and on the Sabbath and purity laws, other kinds of things, where he learns that these are just the trappings of carnal Israel, but of no value to spiritual Israel. So just, one line that really sums this up, I think, very nicely. Paul says, if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the misdeeds of the body, you will live. Killing your body gives you life. Living embodied brings you spiritual death. So there's sort of a paradoxical line, but it gives you a very clear sense of where his priorities lie. And the way that he is casting the Jews, again, which includes him, he's Jewish. It includes Jesus, but they were the Jews who were able to see the spiritualization of Judaism on the horizon, as opposed to most of the Jews who remain trapped in their physical understanding of things. Again, just totally missing the point from Paul's perspective. Okay, so this is giving us a little bit of historical background, but things are going to intensify in a way that I think becomes very, very problematic to try to understand. Because as time goes on, you might have expected that supersessionism, the idea that the Christians have replaced the Jews, that the spiritual Jews have replaced the physical Jews, whatever. You might expect that to lead Christian theologians, to basically say, all right, we've superseded them. Now let's go do our thing. Why? We don't need to be thinking about carnal Israel anymore. We don't need to be preoccupied by the Jews anymore. We've clearly transcended, superseded them. We'd expect that to be especially the case after the 4th century, when the entire Roman Empire becomes Christianized, right? When the number of Christians is growing exponentially from year to year. And yet, Christians in this period are still obsessed with Jews. They can't stop writing and talking and thinking about Jews, even when the number of Jews has shrunk down to a tiny percentage of the population, and the number of Christians has expanded dramatically. And the way we see this in, let's say, the 3rd and 4th centuries especially, is in the writings of a group of Christian authors who composed something called adversus Judaios texts. This is a Greek term, adversus, against, Judaios, the Jews. It's a genre of literature. So again, remember our Barnes and Noble analogy from last time, right? If you went into the bookstore, you would go to the anti-Jewish literature section. And in this period, you would find literally hundreds of different books on the shelf. Every Christian theologian worth their salt has to write a book against the Jews. And the rhetoric in those books, sometimes it also extends into preaching, right? So John Chrysostom, the guy on the screen in front of you, a very famous Greek preacher in the 4th century, lives in Constantinople and gives so many sermons about the Jews in church that he eventually collects them into a book of 10 homilies on the Jews. And I mean, you get a sense of what the content is from a quote like this one. These Jews are gathering choruses of effeminates and a great rubbish heap of harlots. So gendered, anti-Jewish language, sexualized anti-Jewish language, where a harlot has set herself up. That place is a brothel, but the synagogue is not only a brothel and a theater, and he doesn't like theaters, by the way, right? That's not a compliment. It's also a den of robbers and a lodging for wild beasts.
It covers it all.
Yeah, I always love teaching this line in a synagogue. I don't actually, right? It's kind of ironic, but this is what he would make of our gathering here. What is the source of the Jews' hardness? He goes on to say, it comes from gluttony and drunkenness, where when brute animals feed from a full manger, they grow plump and become more obstinate and hard to hold in check. They endure neither the yoke, the reins, nor the hand of the charioteer. So now we have this kind of dehumanizing, animalistic language being used for Jews. Just so, the Jewish people were driven by their drunkenness and plumpness to the ultimate evil. They kicked about, they failed to accept the yoke of Christ, nor did they pull the plow of his teaching. And he says, although such beasts are unfit for work, they are fit for killing. And this is what happened to the Jews. While they were making themselves unfit for work, they grew fit for slaughter. John Chrysostom's name in Greek means the golden-tongued. Chrysostom is, because he was such a successful preacher, that he was known as like a smooth talker, right? And this, I guess, is what passed for golden-tongued preaching back in the day. But this is a very, I'd say, representative sample of what he has to say in his 10 homilies and what hundreds of books that are written against the Jews in this formative period of early Christianity are saying in this adversus Judaios genre. And so again, the question sort of becomes, what is it about this period, about this relationship between these two religious communities that leads Christians in this formative period to remain so obsessed with the Jewish community out of which they emerged? And if people have suggestions, then we can take them. I've got some suggestions, but let's work together too.
Insecurity.
Insecurity.
Insecurity. Do I have insecurity?
There's still Jews around and they didn't all adopt Jesus.
Okay, so great suggestion. Great suggestion, please.
I think of it as a family fight. We started as a Jewish family with ties, with care, with love, and a shared ideology, and then it splits.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a division, and when you have division, it can just get worse and worse. But I tie it down to that they all used to be family.
Okay, all right.
But why not just have the Jews be marginalized at that point? There weren't even probably a lot of Jews in some of the places where they were writing from. Why was it such an issue that they had to make this?
Doubt. When we said insecurity, another word for it is doubt. If this Paul story explaining New Judaism as a stepping out beyond old Judaism, older Judaism, new, older, then why didn't all the Jews become new Jews and Christians?
But why would
They
they
cared. It cast doubt. It gave them theological insecurity. Like,
Mm.
maybe there's a problem here. It doesn't quite hang together.
Could it also underscore the power of the Roman Empire? Because once Constantine accepted Christianity and spread it over, it was like a form of their occupation of other land.
Okay. Yeah, these are all really good directions to think in, I
I
think.
did one more thought.
Please.
Jesus didn't come back,
He did not yet.
right?
Um,
And they said he would. And he-
Yes,
Yeah.
in a month.
So some of the possible suggestions I'm hearing here, right, have to do on some level with psychology, right? Doubt or anxiety or insecurity, right? This is kind of like psychological language that we would use in a way, almost to like psychoanalyze these guys and to say, well, what's really motivating you, right? Or to use the family analogy, right? Like we all know that our trauma goes back to our our familial origins. So we get John Chrysostom down on the couch and we say, like, tell me about your relationship with your siblings. I think there's a lot of validity to that. Other possible directions might have to do with the political context, right? With Constantine. At the end of the day, though, we may or may not be satisfied that those explanations can account for the counterfactual, right? The way things could have gone, which would have been to say, we're the world's power now. The Roman Empire is Christian. We have so much might at our disposal. We have so much, insecurity, fine, but like, why? Why would the Roman Empire be insecure about anything? So if one didn't find that persuasive and said, I still would expect that these guys like get over it already. So that I think, has a certain kind of intuitive, I don't know, it sort of resonates potentially as well.
There's a chat. question.
Yeah, please. I don't see it on my screen for some reason.
Yeah, so we have to
Oh, okay.
pop up there, please.
All right. Well, please keep the questions in the chat coming or starting, folks at home. Let me lay out a couple of possibilities for you, because as maybe you sense from people's just initial knee-jerk reactions, sometimes the nature of how difficult the question is can be seen from how many contrary kinds of explanations people give for it, right? When historians give 3 or 4 or 10 or 20 explanations for the underlying phenomenon, in some ways that's a sign that they don't really know, right? Or else there would just be one easy answer. And there's no one easy answer. So let's instead look at 4 or so different ways of parsing this. And this will bring us back to our initial dichotomy between those eternalist and contextualist attitudes towards understanding anti-Semitism. Okay, so first and most provocative explanation. In the 1970s, a Catholic theologian, a sort of progressive Catholic theologian named Rosemary Radford Ruther, wrote a series of articles in which she argued that the reason for Adversus Judaios literature is because Christianity as a religion is fundamentally anti-Semitic. This is not David Shyovitz speaking, okay? This is me channeling one of 4 approaches that we're going to look at, but it was voiced by a Catholic theologian. She said that the core of Christology, of the way of understanding the role of Jesus in his relationship to the church, the core of that is Paul's idea of supersessionism. There's no Christianity without supersessionism, and there can be no supersessionism without a hierarchical relationship that puts Christians above Jews, spiritual Israel above carnal Israel. In other words, the core of Christian faith is the denigration of Jews.
They're wrong and we're right.
Not just they're wrong and we're right, because Jews think that Christians are wrong, and Hindus are wrong, or meaning in different historical time places, lots of religions think that they are right and the others are wrong. But what Christianity does is it makes the wrongness of Judaism the fundamental ingredient in their own election. If all the Hindus in the world, if Hinduism had never come into existence, some counterfactual, right? Then Jews who don't believe in Hinduism would not really be affected by that in any way. Like, my Jewishness is not in any way tied to anybody else's religious identity. Whereas what Ruther argued is that for Paul and for the long line of theologians who came after him, it's inconceivable to imagine Christianity other than as a anti-Jewish set of sort of hierarchical power relations. And so she said, if you want to solve the problem of Christian anti-Semitism, you need to solve the problem of Christianity. And she was, as I said, a very radical, in some ways, and progressive theologian. She also advocated for female ordination within the priesthood, right? Like lots of the progressive issues within 20th century Catholicism. But the argument she made that generated a huge amount of discussion in Catholic theological circles was we need to basically reinterpret Paul in this radical way that will get rid of supersessionism, but that's going to mean a fundamental change to how we understand Christianity. Like a radical break would be necessary. So her answer would be, why adversus Judaeus literature? Why does John call the Jews the children of the devil? It's because Christianity and the anti-Semitism are essentially inextricably intertwined. Why is are Christian authors saying anti-Semitic stuff? Because they're anti-Semites, because they're Christians, right? That's how that argument would go. You could probably sense from the tenor of that argument that it didn't, get a lot of enthusiastic support among the more conservative traditionalist circles of, the Catholic Church, who are basically being told, we need to like a do-over, right, in order to get rid of this core issue that we have in our theology. And so other historians have gone in very different kinds of directions. Yeah, Rabbi London, please.
Should you call them anti-Semites or anti-Judaists, meaning, that they don't have something that's wrong about Jews if they were to take on Christianity, but it's about Judaism itself. So I just wonder in terms of the language, that anti-Semitism is a newer piece of language.
Yeah.
Anti-Judaism.
Yeah. No, great point. So I use the term anti-Semitism because it's the term that she uses in the essay, but I think we can actually understand why she would, because in a way, this argument falls into the eternalist camp, right? Where even though the term anti-Semitism is invented in Germany in the late 19th century, it is an expression of a fundamental Western Christian anti-Jewishness, anti-Semitism, right? Supersessionism that's built into the crux of Western civilization. And so I think for somebody like her, she would say, actually, the term anti-Semitism is appropriate because what happens later in the 19th and 20th centuries, and especially the Holocaust for her is like really core to this, is a manifestation of this original sin, so to speak, right, of supersessionism. She would say it's no coincidence that the Holocaust happened in a, nominally at least, Christian nation that was heir to all of this theological tradition, and lots of the efforts on the parts of Christians from the late 1950s onward, like for Ruther, is to try to figure out, like, where did Christianity go wrong such that the Holocaust could have happened in Christian Europe? And again, for her, the answer is it went wrong with Christianity. But let's look at a couple of other possibilities. A second explanation, and this is one that came up in some people's comments before, is to say, what would motivate somebody like John Chrysostom to talk about how the synagogue is a brothel and a theater and an animal's den, all these horrible terms that he uses to refer to Jewish practice and the synagogue and to Jewish communities. So we might see that as evidence of the fact that people were super anti-Semitic back then, right? You read a text like that, and intuitively, what you are led to conclude, I think, like at least on a knee-jerk level, is, God, these guys really hated Jews. Like, read this. Some scholars have argued, though, that we need to read it exactly in the opposite way. That when you find a text like this one, and you start to think, why did John Chrysostom feel the need to preach this week after week from the pulpit? So one argument is because precisely it wasn't obvious to people. People didn't believe this, and that's why he kept trying to knock them over the head, right, by convincing them of it. We actually have a pulpit rabbi in the room, so I won't ask you to speak about this community, but we could imagine a shul somewhere where a rabbi gives, repeated haranguing addresses to the community and tries to convince them of something, right? And the fact that the rabbi needs to keep talking about a certain topic week after week, that's not a sign that everybody agrees with, right, with them. It's a sign that actually it's not obvious to them what they're being told. And one of the possible explanations for this would be that although we, for a long time, scholars were for a long time accustomed to thinking that Paul comes on the scene, he opens Christianity up to the outside world, Christianity becomes a Gentile religion, and Judaism remains Jewish. So in fact, there's good evidence to suggest that for really centuries, into the 4th century, there were at least some people who remained Jewish Christians. People who thought that their Jewishness was important to them, who believed that the Messiah had come and his name was Jesus, but understood that within a Jewish framework. And those people went to synagogue on Saturday and they went to church on Sunday. And those two religious identities weren't seen as being incompatible with each other. Whereas John Chrysostom arguably is saying, stay the hell away from the synagogue. What are you guys doing? Go to church, be a Christian. To be a Christian is not to be a Jew. That fusion is a thing of the past, right? That ship has sailed. But the fact, again, that he needs to keep telling people that might be a sign that there are so many people who actually like Jews and Judaism, right? This is kind of a weird thing where you see somebody's anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish or very nasty anti-Jewish writings. And rather than conclude that this shows that people hated Jews back then, you conclude, oh, this actually shows that people probably didn't really hate Jews back then. Because if they did, then why would we need somebody to write about it? That kind of makes sense. The analogy I use sometimes is like, I don't know, with if you pass a ton of laws against speeding, right, in the Evanston City Council or whatever, that's probably not a sign that nobody speeds, right? It's probably a sign that everybody's speeding and they don't take seriously the warnings not to speed. So we can think, sort of in similar terms about this. Okay, third possibility. Each of these, as you'll see, are different enough from each other that, again, it just shows how difficult a question this is. The third possibility is that some scholars have argued that when somebody like John Chrysostom writes this nasty anti-Jewish text, the synagogue is a brothel, the Jews are murderers, the children of Satan, blah, 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 that it's another one of these cases where continuities in form blind us to differences in meaning. So the argument here goes that when Christians were writing Adversus Judaeos texts in huge numbers over the course of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, the people they were actually writing about were not the Jews. They were writing about, for the most part, their fellow Christians. Because to be a Christian in this early period of time was not a unitary identity. This was a profoundly sectarian period in Christian history, where there are dozens of different groups that all call themselves Christians, but differ with each other on a lot of fundamental issues. So for example, was Jesus simultaneously human and God, or was he God and then human and then God again? Is the Trinity 3 in 1 or 1 in 3? Is the way that you take communion the literal body and blood of Christ when you take communion in church, or is it a symbol for something? There's 1.5 million different theological tenets that have just there hasn't been enough time for Christians to iron this out yet. And so you end up with what will become the Catholics, but also with Pelagians and also with Arians and also with, I don't know, there's literally dozens of Christian sects. And they're constantly fighting with one another about issues of theology. And the argument here goes, the way you fight fellow Christians on issues of theology is by calling your religious opponents Jews. In other words, Adversus Judaeos texts in this argument are not addressed to Jews. They're addressed to Christians, but they use the term Jew as an insult. Why? Because they all read the Bible. And they know from Paul that to be a Jew means to be blind to the truth. To be a Jew means to be carnal and not spiritual. To be a Jew means to be mistaken about theological matters. So if I'm arguing with somebody and I want to call them a jerk or an idiot or, whatever, I'm going to call them a Jew. Now, that's not good for the Jews, right? Obviously. But maybe it's not really addressed to the Jews in any kind of a direct way. Let me give you an example of how this works. One of the earliest Christian sectarian divides is between the group that will eventually become the Catholic Church and a group that's called the Marcionites. I didn't put this on the slide. I probably should have. Marcion, Marcion. He was a Christian theologian, I think in the 2nd century. And he argued basically, Marcion argued, that the arrival of Christ caused a rupture, a dramatic rupture in the covenant that God had made with humanity. And when the Christians replaced the Jews, there remains no purpose whatsoever anymore for Jews. The Old Testament was a completely irrelevant, a dead letter. And so Marcion said that the Bible, the Christian Bible, should only begin with the Gospels, and we should basically get rid of the Old Testament altogether, right? Whereas if you go into a church today, you're going to have the Old Testament, then the New Testament. Marcion said, no Old Testament. The Jewish God is a complete perversion. There's nothing about the Jews or about the pre-Christian era that should be preserved. And do you know what he called his opponents? The people who argued that, no, we should hold on to the Old Testament. No, there are important promises in that text that were fulfilled in the New Testament. He called his opponents Jews. Yeah, Judaizers. Oh, you guys want to hold on to the Old Testament? That's super Jewish of you. And he wrote a text called Adversus Judaios against his Jewish opponents, but they really were Christians. Now, do you know what the opponents of Marcion said back to him? They said, Marcion, you don't get it. You think we need to get rid of the Old Testament because it's been completely abrogated. But that's because you're not capable of reading the Old Testament on a spiritual level, the way it's supposed to be read. And you know who else can't read things on a spiritual level, only on a physical level? The Jews. So the response to Marcion, who called his opponents Jews, was to say, no, you're the Jews. Now, are either of them interested in actual Jews? No. They are interested in what scholars call hermeneutical Jews, Jews as interpretive objects. But to read these Adversus Judaios texts and say, people must have really hated Jews back then. So the response would be, no, actually, they didn't care about Jews at all. They just wanted to insult each other using the most insulting term they could think of, which was Jew, right? So again, very different from some of the other approaches. And then a final one, and then I want to move briefly into the Middle Ages. A final interpretation is to say, you know, let's go back to Rosemary Redford Ruther. Christianity is built on supersessionism. Christianity is intrinsically anti-Semitic. We can blame the Christian tradition for much of what happened later on to the Jews in history. So some scholars respond to that argument and say, you're imagining that the first time anybody wrote anything nasty about Jews in the ancient world was in the Gospels. These scholars would say, go back 100, 200, 300 years, read Greco-Roman texts about the Jews. There are lots of them. And you'll find that people were writing nasty anti-Jewish stuff long before Jesus was a twinkle in his mother's eye or his father's eye or whatever. In other words, they would say the reason you find anti-Jewish stuff in early Christianity is because the ancient world was full of anti-Jewish stuff, and the ancient Christians adopted that the same way that everybody else did. But to blame Christianity for anti-Jewish sentiment is to miss the fact that for hundreds of years, all of those tropes had already been circulating. And it turns out that if you read lots of Greek and Latin authors, pre-Christian, who are writing about Jews and Judaism, they have horribly nasty things to say about the Jews. Some of it actually sounds a lot like what Haman said, or supposedly said. There's this nation, but they're different. They can't be assimilated. Think about the Roman Empire, which was so homogenizing, or tried to be so homogenizing in its attitude towards its conquered subject populations. We fused together all the pantheons into one, right? Everybody has to come together to make offerings to the emperor. The Jews don't do any of this stuff. The Jews hold themselves apart. And the Roman and Greek authors say, basically, yeah, that's because they're different than us in a fundamental way, and we can't tolerate that. We can't accept it. There's all kinds of speculation among Greek and Roman authors as to what it is that the Jews are doing in their temple in Jerusalem, where they don't let any non-Jews in, and they've got this Holy of Holies, where supposedly only the high priest can go. What do you think they're really up to in there? I bet they're actually cannibalizing Greeks. I bet they're drinking our blood. I bet they've got a statue of a donkey. This is one of these bizarre things that circulates on their altar that they are paying homage to because they worship donkeys. You name it, Roman authors are saying it about the Jews. And again, this is before Christianity is even on the scene. So one of our eternalist scholars would say Christian anti-Semitism gives birth later on to later examples of anti-Semitism, like the medieval stuff we'll talk about in a second, but it also draws on ancient anti-Semitism, and it's a long, continuous pattern that basically extends throughout history in this unchanging form. Whereas one of our contextualist scholars would say, no, maybe this is actually about hermeneutical Jews and not real Jews. Maybe this is about the fact that people loved Jews and went to synagogue all the time, rather than the fact that they actually hated them the way that John Chrysostom told them that they should. Depending on which of these approaches you take, you end up with a very different understanding of the connection between instances of anti-Jewishness in different times and places, right? Can we sort of see this? The patterns we're going to construct are going to be very different depending on which of these kinds of analytical approaches that we take. Okay, let me pause there because I've been talking a lot. Questions, comments, pushback, anything and everything.
So you mentioned in older Greco-Roman writings, there's plenty of anti-Semitic tropes. But the story of the Jesus era and the Romans and their practices in Palestine, I'm not recalling that the Romans, in those stories, in those texts, there was much commentary or much discussion of this Greco-Roman classic anti-Semitism.
So in which kinds of texts do you mean?
Well, even the Gospels, the Romans seem like, I mean, gotta remember who the author was, but
Yeah.
the Romans don't grossly exhibit anti-Jewish behavior because the Pilate and Herod, not Herod, but
Yeah.
were part of this ancient stream of Greco-Roman anti-Semitism.
Right. So I mean, I guess one could say that, those are not texts that we would want to characterize as Greco-Roman anti-Jewish texts, right? In some ways, they're Jewish texts, right? Written. So just, I guess, whose viewpoints would be centered in those texts in the Gospels are going to be different maybe than in some of the other texts that I'm referring to. There's a great collection for those who are interested. Actually, you can find the whole thing online. It's a collection. It's like 1,000 pages long. It's called Greek and Latin Authors on Jews and Judaism. It was edited by a guy named Menachem Stern, Israeli historian. And it's just a compilation of dozens, hundreds of passages from Tacitus and from Seneca and from, like the greatest hits of Greco-Roman culture, who almost to a man have very negative things to say about Jews for a lot of the reasons we've been talking about. Please.
What was the Jewish response to this?
That's a great question. It's a great question. So we could do a whole series of classes exactly on this issue. So there's a lot of interesting evidence about Jewish responses to Greco-Roman thought. And some of that, ironically, we find like in the Talmud and in rabbinic literature, where there's a lot of recorded dialogues of this and this rabbi spoke to Vespasian, right? Or like they're probably not real dialogues historically, but they show a kind of like an awareness on the part of the Jews.
Yochanan ben Zakkai never spoke to Vespasian?
You didn't hear it from me. But Rabbi Judah the Prince probably did speak to lots of Romans, right? So what would it have been like if the Jews had had a chance to talk back to the Roman Empire, basically? Or maybe they actually did in some cases. So you definitely find that there is engagement about some of these issues. When you find it in the Talmud, obviously, the ending favors the Jews, right? Like they're the ones who get the last word in the conversations. But even in subsequent medieval sources, so you'll find lots of Jewish, and in the Talmud too, lots of Jewish sort of like responses to the way that Christians are polemicizing against them. So there's a huge body of Adversus Judaeos text. There's a much smaller body, but it exists, of Jewish anti-Christian writings. Mostly from the Middle Ages, but a few seem to go back to antiquity, where Jews show that they know what is being said about them and they can give as good as they get. So that line from the Talmud that I talked about, where the Jews take credit for having killed Jesus, like that's a great example of this. They know this is a very dangerous thing to admit to, but there's also a certain kind of satisfaction you get from saying like, oh, you know how I'm being oppressed by these Christians all the time? Well, I got them, right? We managed to kill their God. Or there's a fascinating text called Toldot Yeshu, the history of Jesus, which is a Hebrew anti-Christian gospel account written by the Jews about the life of Jesus, where the whole thing is like full of scatological humor and Jesus is always like, like wetting himself. And it's very, very disparaging. There's a lot of like gross sexual humor there. But again, it's an attempt on the part of the Jews who know that they are the recipient of a lot of this very negative sentiment to try and sort of give back in a way that maybe gave them a little bit of satisfaction. I saw other hands, I thought. Please.
So I guess my question is, regardless, almost, you know, which category, or, you know, the people are trying to figure it out differently. It still sounds like there is this piece where, yes, it can be looked at contextually, but where there was anti-Semitism, I'll still use that term.
Yeah.
Because I'm not, that's, even though I know that might not be totally correct.
No, that's fine.
But, when people in power are spewing all of this, and I even look at today, then you see a rise in all of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I definitely, would not want to say that I don't think that even the most aggressive contextualist would say that, there's no benefit to looking at longer term patterns. Right. I think at the end of the day, we have these two ideal types. Do you look sort of synchronically, right? Do you look at the immediate circumstances, or do you look diachronically? Do you only look at patterns? And chances are that the truth, as it usually is going to be somewhere in between, right? Where there's some things that are contextual and that helps us understand the underlying phenomenon. But even contextual things will have reverberations later on in history. I mean, that's unquestionable. Let me give you an example of this. We're not gonna have time to do justice to the Middle Ages in the next 7 minutes. But let me give you just two quick examples that hopefully will sharpen a little bit of this. So over the course of the Middle Ages, probably if you know anything about medieval Jewish history, some of the immediate things that are triggered for you might be crusades and massacres and persecution and expulsions. Maybe you know the term of the blood libel. This is the idea that Jews ritually kill Christian children to drink their blood and sometimes to make matzah out of them. So the sort of amount of anti-Jewish, violently anti-Christian, anti-Jewish material that we take out of the study of the Middle Ages, I think a lot of this is sort of well known to people, or if not well known in detail, then at least we have some of these connotations when we think about like the Dark Ages, right, vis-a-vis the Jews. But let's take a look at just two data points. So the first is from the exterior of a very beautiful Gothic cathedral in Strasbourg in Western France, in Eastern France, excuse me, like very near the border between France and Germany, where you find over the entrance, people maybe have seen these statues before. If you spend enough time with me, eventually you get to see these statues, which are representations on the exterior of the church of Judaism and Christianity in a very prominent place right above the entrance of many Gothic cathedrals, not just in Strasbourg, Notre Dame in Paris. If you go to Germany, to Worms or to Bamberg and other places, like these are everywhere, this pairing. And the way that this sort of works iconographically, as I'm sure some of you may know, is that on the left, we see the church, ecclesia, in personified form, with a crown, holding the cross, sort of very, standing ramrod straight, looking out at the city, holding in her left arm a chalice. This is like from Havdalah, Kosi Shuotasa, I will raise up the chalice of salvation. This is the chalice of salvation. And it's associated with salvation because when you go to take communion, right, at Mass in the Catholic tradition, the wine that's in the chalice is the blood of Christ. So it's the blood of Christ that brings salvation. And that is allied here with triumph, with royalty, with power, right? That's all the church. The synagogue, the Jews, are looking down. If you look carefully, she's blindfolded, right? The Jews are in self-imposed darkness because they don't accept the light of Christ, right? They prefer to live in the darkness of theological error. She's holding in one hand a staff that is broken into pieces, in the other hand, a book. That's the Old Testament, right? The Jews hold on to the Old Testament, and that's why they are downtrodden. That's why they are theologically blind. That's why they're powerless, whereas we, the Christians, are powerful. Really fascinating pairing of images. today, you know, the majority of tourists who are like walk and take pictures of the outside of the church, they have no idea what they're looking at, including, I've, you know, been in Paris a couple times, and you see, you know, like obviously Jewish people like taking pictures and smiling, and they don't know what they're looking at either. And yet, to a medieval audience, the meaning here would have been obvious. Now let's contrast that for a second. Oh, I have a bunch more slides I don't have time to get into, but that's Notre Dame's version in Paris. And this one is fun because the blindfold that Synagoga has on her head is actually a live snake that's coiling around her head. So we've got sort of the symbolism of, again, theological error, the serpent in the Garden of Eden, right? You get all the ideas. Okay, let's take this and contrast it for a second with this that we saw last time. Remember? Maybe you remember Morty Shapiro and Piggy Morty and the Judenzow. Jews eat pig feces. Jews suckle on pigs. Jews have horns. They are physically different than we are. And what's on the, do you guys remember what's on the back? We talked about this, I think, right? Who's lying on the hillside there? Simon of Trent, the blood libel victim. A Jewish child that the Jews, you can see all the needles in him. The Jews drained his blood to bake their matzahs with. We have encoded in this image so much just like fantastical anti-Jewish sentiment. This was an image that was drawn copying a mural, a massive mural that was on the bridge tower leading into the German city of Frankfurt am Main. I don't remember how much detail we gave about this last time, but right as you cross in the Middle Ages, as you cross the bridge into Frankfurt, there was a big tower anchoring one side of the bridge that had this massive mural on the side. It was like the welcome to Frankfurt, right? Home of the Judenzow. And so we get lots of different pictures drawn by people who see this mural, are very impressed by it. They copy it down, right? And eventually the bridge is torn down, but we still have the images. I think we looked at this last time also, right? It's also in sculpture, still to this day in Wittenberg, right? You will find the rabbini, the rabbis, who are looking for Shem HaMeforash. They're looking for God's revealed name in the pig's anus. Now let's take these two examples and just for a second, think about patterns versus distinctions. Because on the one hand, we see Synagoga and Ecclesia, and we see the Judenzow, and we see the public artwork on the bridge into Frankfurt, and we think there's something very common here, right? Among them, everywhere you look in this medieval European society, you're being smacked over the head by Christian, anti-Jewish visual sort of depictions, right? Whether it's the bridge, whether it's the church, whether it's the statue, everybody's walking around in a symbolic kind of universe that is just saturated with opposition to denigration of Jews, right? However, there have been some historians who've tried to distinguish between these kinds of examples, and again, said they have maybe more differentiating them from one another than they do in common. Let me give you an example of how this argument goes. I'm not saying that I believe this argument, but I'll lay it out for you. There's a very influential historian who wrote in the 70s and 80s named Gavin Langmuir. Not a Jewish guy, but for complicated reasons, got fascinated by the history of anti-Semitism. And he basically argued that what we're looking at here, we should call anti-Semitism. Sure, he knows the term anti-Semitism didn't arise until the 19th century, but Langmuir says, what's the essence of 19th century anti-Semitism? It's fantastical, false, imaginary accusations against Jews that are not rooted in any observable reality. So for Wilhelm Marr, that's the idea of Semitism and race, right? The idea that Jews are biologically different from Christians. It's just not true. It's not true on a genetic level. It's not true on a physiognomic level, right? Race, I think probably a lot of us would today accept, is a social category and not a biological category, at least in a meaningful way. And so when Wilhelm Marr says the Jews are physically different than the Christians, and that's the source of their differentness, That's a sort of an imaginary, fantastical, there's just no accuracy to it. And Langmuir said, the same is the case for this. No Christian ever saw a Jew searching for God's name in a pig's anus. It just never happened. No Jews went to synagogue and ate pig feces. No Jews had actual horns on their head. In the Middle Ages, no Jews ever drank the blood of Christian children and made it into matzah. These are all imaginary fantasies. And he says that because they have that in common with the 19th century variety, and certainly, let's say with the Nazi variety, right? Nazi anti-Semitism also is not predicated on real things about Jews. It's predicated on a whole imaginary edifice of false anti-Semitic beliefs. So Langmuir said, therefore, what connects all these things together is that anti-Semitism is about denigrating Jews for things that they actually don't do, right? For things that are not actually true about them. Whereas Gavin Langmuir, Langmuir. Whereas these statues, Langmuir said, are not nice. They're not pleasant. You certainly wouldn't endorse them, but they're not anti-Semitic. Because in a certain way, they're true. Jews do reject Jesus. Jews are not believers in Christianity. And so when you put statues up on your church that remind everybody in town that the Jews are different than us because they don't accept the truth of our theology. So again, that might be very nasty. I'm not saying anybody should do this. But Langmuir would say, it's not anti-Semitic in the same way that this is, because ultimately it's true. It's rooted in true observations about the Jews, as opposed to this, which is rooted in false, what he would call chimerical accusations against the Jews. This is the term he uses. A chimera, right, is an imaginary monster from Greek mythology, something that never existed. And so Langmuir would say that when we shift in the Middle Ages from anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism, that shift is going from hating Jews for what they are to hating Jews for what they aren't. And the latter is what links up with the Holocaust, with Nazism, with modern anti-Semitism. But the anti-Judaism, again, it's not good, but it's just not the same. So he would argue that you could sort of cut the baby down the middle, so to speak, right? It's not that anti-Semitism doesn't exist as a timeless, as a long-term phenomenon, but it also doesn't go back to the book of Esther. There's nothing about the Gospels, he would say, that is anti-Semitic. Because again, it's predicated on the idea that the Jews rejected Jesus, which they in fact did do. Now, does that help us in any way? I mean, I hope at the least it shows us another example of how terminological specificity allows us to either recognize or sometimes to reject patterns that can lead us to misunderstand the phenomena, right, that we are studying or that we are experiencing. Probably the corollary to this would be, and this is something that this will end on a very controversial note, and I'm not telling you what I think. I'm just going to tell you an argument that has been advanced lately among historians. So there's a very distinguished scholar at Harvard University named Derek Penslar. He's been in the news lately. Some of you may know who he is. If not, don't worry about it, but he's written a bunch of biographies of Herzl. He's really a wonderful scholar. And he wrote a book recently that was not timed for the post-October 7th era, but it happened to coincide with it, where he argued that for a Palestinian to apply a double standard to, or to demonize, or to express visceral hatred for the state of Israel, he says, is not anti-Semitic because it's predicated on something that from their vantage point is true rather than false. Again, this is not me weighing in on politics. Please, please believe me. I'm laying out this argument as a way of just bringing this into focus for us. What are the stakes of this for our own time period? So if you see accusations against the state of Israel as being like the Judenzow, right? The state of Israel is being accused of absurd, ridiculous, patently false accusations. So then if you follow the Langmuir approach, when you accuse Jews of doing things that they don't really do, that's anti-Semitism. Hating Jews for what they aren't is anti-Semitic. Penzlar says that if you accept any of the truth claims of people who have suffered at the hands of the state of Israel, then when they voice their hatred on the basis of true facts rather than false facts, then that hatred, it might be anti-Zionist, it might be bad, it might be terrible, but it doesn't fit the rubric of anti-Semitism in the same way that accusing the Jews of rejecting Jesus is an anti-Semitism. It's true, the Jews do reject Jesus. So this is just one of the ways in which, depending on the filter that we apply, the way we use these terms is going to differ dramatically. The way we construct patterns across Jewish history is going to differ dramatically. And some of that then just comes down to, what is your sort of belief about the underlying truth claims of what Jews were or weren't doing in the Middle Ages, what Israeli soldiers are or aren't doing in the present moment, right? It sort of shifts the conversation away from anti-Semitism, yes or no, to, well, what do we mean by anti-Semitism, and how does it or doesn't it link up with other links in the chain of what we are calling anti-Semitism, which again, as we saw from the get-go, can differ dramatically. We have those 4 different approaches to the swastika Star of David example, and there's at least that many different ways of defining this term, which then is going to lead, I think, to principled disagreement among people as to how we take this term and understand it for the purposes of interpreting our own reality. We're over time, more so than I even realized. I apologize. We'll end there, and I hope that at the very least this gives us some food for thought. If we had 9 weeks to work with, as I'm teaching this course for the alumni of Northwestern, there's a lot more time to expand on some of these ideas, but I hope that at the very least we've hit on a couple of punchy examples from the ancient past and started to think about how they may shape our thinking or our debates or our arguments about very real present day concerns. Thank you.
Unanswerable questions, what if they result in the same thing? If the Crusades, I think you're saying that the Crusades were generated by sort of a different animus than the Holocaust.
Right.
What if they end up with the same result?
So that's a great question, right? Ultimately, are these distinctions without a difference? I think that is a plausible response. Yeah. Hi.
Thank you. I'm David Graham.
Hey.
If you want to use